This video was sponsored by Husk.
Oh, hi there. Welcome to another video. You guys want to know what makes cabinet making exponentially more difficult? Anytime you stop building things square and start trying to make it round. It's just harder. But luckily for you, I just made this video and you can see exactly how I made these round cabinet doors and face frame. So watch the video, check out the video description for links to all the tools that I used in the video. And if you're not doing so already, go sign up on Patreon. You could already watch this video yesterday without any YouTube ads. What are you even thinking? Go sign up. Enjoy the video.
You know what wives are really good at? Taking simple projects and making them complicated. Honey, could you make curved cabinet doors instead of square? I've never made curved cabinet doors a day in my life. I have no clue what I'm doing. But, shoot, that's never stopped me before. Let's get this thing flippin' done. Now, normally when I'm doing any sort of built-in cabinet, I like to build the carcass first and then make my face frame. But I figured since this face frame is going to be pretty complicated, I'd just go ahead and do the face frame first and then I'll build the carcass to fit after the fact. Now this face frame is going to go together like most cabinet face frames with a few small modifications. Instead of just putting a piece of square stock at the top that's usually around 5 to 6 inches thick, I had to glue up a giant piece that I could then cut a half circle out of and create an opening for my half circle doors. So I started milling up a bunch of poplar because this will be painted and poplar paints great. After I got it all milled up, I first glued a panel together that would be the top of my face frame and give me enough space to cut that half circle, half moon, rounded shape dealy-mabob. So just with a little glue and a few clamps, I got this thing squeezed together. Then while that dried, I started milling up all of my other pieces for the other parts of the face frame. This is where the rest of the face frame's truly going to be a plain Jane standard cabinet face frame. So I ripped a bunch of pieces down to 2 1/4 inches wide because that's what I always use for face frames. I don't know why, I just like that number, I guess. By the time I was done with that, my panel was all dry and ready to be taken out of clamps. Next, I went over to the chop saw and I started chopping down all the pieces for my internal drawer dividers. These are going to have to be the exact same width as that panel I just glued up. So I cut these down to size first. I think they were right around like 30 1/4 inches. I don't remember. And then after I had all those trimmed down, I used the track saw to get a straight edge on one end of my panel, and then I cut the other side over on the table saw. Cutting a long piece sideways like this on the table saw can get a little shady sometimes, so if you're not comfortable with that cut, make sure you use a crosscut sled. Now with all the pieces cut for my face frame, it was finally time to start piecing this thing together. As you can see, I have my 2 stiles on the outside and then a whole plethora of rails for the inside. Are they still called stiles and rails when it's a face frame and not a door or a drawer face? I honestly don't know, but it sounds good, so we're gonna go with it. Now normally I just hook my face frames together with pocket holes. But because we're going to have to cut this nice half circle, I really didn't want to accidentally run into some pocket screws. So I thought maybe dominoes would be a better way to go. Just in case. You know, always plan ahead. But I still wanted to try and not cut through those dominoes, so I just hammered a nail in the center of my piece, wrapped a string around it and a pencil, and then just roughly traced where my half circle is going to be cut. No, this isn't going to be exact, but at least it'll give me a good enough idea so I can try and place my dominoes and not cut into them, if at all possible. As you can see here, I just marked out where I thought dominoes could land without getting sliced open, and then I pulled out the domino joiner and started drilling some mortises. This process was a little too loud for the foreman, but he was nice enough to let me continue, and he didn't even dock my pay. After mortising out my holes in the stiles, is that what we're going with? I did the same thing to the rail at the top, squirted in some glue, hammered in a few dominoes, and then I squeezed the entire thing together. In hindsight, I could have totally just used pocket screws and made sure to avoid where I was going to cut, but, you know, I was being cautious, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. After I got one side on, I plopped the other side on, and I put the entire thing in clamps and waited for it to dry. Which can take a... Oh, look at that, it's dry already. Oh, man, videos. Magical. After it was dry, I pulled it out of clamps, and then I decided to hook in all of my drawer dividers and my bottom plate. And for this, I went back to my roots and just used some pocket screws and some glue. I plopped everything in place, screwing it in from the back side of the face frame. Obviously, we don't want visible pocket holes on the front. I mean, come on. I don't know. That. Now, whenever I have stacked drawer dividers, I like to install them like this. First, I screw in my bottom plate, making sure it's perfectly flush with my two outside stiles. Then I just cut some, scrap pieces that are setup blocks, and I plop one on each side. This ensures that my drawer dividers go in perfectly square and spaced out exactly how I want them. Fortunately for me, all three of these drawers are the exact same size at 10¼ inches, so I just work my way up until all three dividers are in place, and then I give everything a thorough sanding. I love sanding. Frickin' sanding. Now that the face frame is entirely put together and sanded smooth, I can finally cut out that half circle profile needed for my door opening. For this, I'm just using this little Rockler circle cutting jig. I use the same hole that I used for that nail earlier with the piece of string. I plop the jig in place, and I just double check to make sure that the blade comes right to the edge of the face frame on either side. Then I just start cutting it out. Now, I had a circle jig lie to me when I was young, so I've never quite trusted them to do their job proficiently. I mean, they do a fine job cutting a circle, but I'm always afraid that the more passes I do, the more likely there will be a mess up. So I just usually do 1 or 2 passes and then stop with the circle jig and set it aside. Then I come in with a jigsaw and I roughly cut out that shape, making sure to stay far away from my finish line. After I get it completely cut out with the jigsaw, you will see here in just a moment, there's this nice little ridge at the bottom. That's where I haven't cut my perfect circle yet, but I can use my top initial passes as a router template. So I flip the entire thing over, and then I grab my router with one of these guys. A bottom bearing flush mount, trim bit, upcut, downcut, spiral, cutter, head. I think that's what they're called. Anyways, zip zap zoop, and I trim this baby down nice and flush, and I've got a perfect half circle radius at the top of my face frame. Bada bing, bada boom. And with that, the face frame is essentially done. Nice and curvy and looking clean. Yeah. But the bad news for me is the face frame was actually the easy part. Now I gotta somehow make doors that perfectly fit inside here and match that curved radius. 2 words come to mind: bent lamination. The first thing I needed to do was create another template that was the exact same shape and profile as my face frame. This was pretty easy. I just grabbed a piece of 3/4 inch MDF, stuck it underneath my piece, traced out that curve, and then roughly cut out that shape with the jigsaw. When I say roughly, I mean don't go over your traced out line. We're basically just removing some material so we can come back in with the router and get it perfect. But the more material we remove ahead of time, the less dust we're gonna have to eat later on with the router. So after roughly cutting it out, I clamp it to the top of my face frame, and now my face frame is essentially my router template to get a perfectly matched profile onto this piece of MDF. So again, with the flush cut trim bit, I go over the entire thing, and now we have a mirror image of our face frame. Then I glued this MDF directly to my face frame. No, I'm just kidding. That'd be crazy. I glued a piece of 1/2 inch MDF on top of the 3/4 inch MDF. The only purpose for this was I wanted to make my template just a little bit thicker. You see, my face frame is 3/4 of an inch, so if I glue up my bent lamination to 3/4 of an inch, well, that's going to be a pretty hard target to hit. I wanted to glue it up much thicker than that, so I would have some wiggle room to mill it up after the glue up was done. So with that piece of 1/2 inch glued on top, again with the flush trim bit, I cut out a nice half circle profile to match the one below. Then I took, yet again, another piece of 1/2 inch MDF, and this time I glued the entire thicker template to just a square piece of 1/2 inch MDF. I really just needed a base to this whole jig that I'm making so that I would have a place to set my stock. So a little glue, a few clamps, and now I had what was starting to look like a little bending form. There was just one slight issue. You see, I'm going to put a zillion strips in here and try and bend them, so I need to get clamps all the way along the perimeter. But these big chunks of MDF are going to make that mighty hard to do. So I needed to alter this bending form in a way that I could get clamps around the entire outside. So I just grabbed my track saw and started cutting off waste, making sure to cut a lot of little square surfaces to my curved profile. This would give me the perfect area to put a bunch of clamps on. And it looked something like, well, this. Kind of like a dodecahedron on the outside and a circle on the inside. Is a dodecahedron a real thing? Kind of sounds like the name of a retirement home in New Mexico. Anyways, as you can see now, I will be able to get clamps all the way around the outside. So with my form made, you just take a piece of wood, stick it in there like this, and bend it. Oh. No, that's actually not going to work. In order to make wood bend in a way it doesn't want to, well, you just got to cut it thin enough that it has no choice but to bend, like this. And you just got to do it with a lot of strips until you build up enough material that you get your desired thickness. So we need a whole bunch of strips of poplar cut. So what I did was I just went over to the table saw and I set my saw so that it cut an 1/8 inch strip on the outside of the blade. Then I'd cut one and I'd move it over. I'm really actually cutting about 3/16 of an inch because I want them just over an 1/8. And I'll show you why here in just a second. So yes, I cut a zillion strips and they looked something like this. Now because I cut them just over an 1/8 of an inch, I could then go over to the planer and mill them down to exactly an 1/8 of an inch. I picked an 1/8 of an inch because it'd be really easy to determine how wide of a glue up I'm doing. See, 18 pieces would be 2 1/4 inches thick, which will match my face frame very nicely. So with all my pieces cut, I just started layering them in this form to double check that they would bend, that none of them were going to snap in half and make me look like an idiot, and that with the right amount of clamping pressure, it would fit the form the way I wanted it to. Pretty confident that it was going to work, at least I hope it works. I got a bunch of wax paper and I covered my work surface with it. Because wax paper keeps the government from reading your thoughts. Oh no, wait, that's tinfoil. I covered my work surface with wax paper because I will be using epoxy to glue this entire bending lamination thing up. And, well, the wax paper keeps the epoxy from sticking to my work surface. Why am I using an epoxy, you ask? Well, it's because it's got way longer of an open time and I didn't want to have to rush this glue up. Next, I put a layer of wax paper on the inside of my form as well so that I wouldn't glue all these pieces of wood to my form and make it impossible to get them out. Then I took my first strip and I just lightly held it in place with a clamp because I did not want to put glue on this one. Then I mixed up a bunch of Total Boat, baby, and it looked like this. I don't know why I'm showing you this part, except that it's fun to show epoxy used in the correct way, not for something stupid like a river table. Once my epoxy was thoroughly mixed, I took a paint roller and I started rolling on a nice thin layer to one side of all of my strips. I want to stress a nice thin layer. You might be tempted to put just a whole goop of epoxy on here, thinking you really want to make sure this thing stays together, but the more epoxy you put on there, the harder it's going to be to clamp it up and keep everything aligned perfectly. It's just going to want to slip and slide all over the place like your Uncle Fred's fingers on his iPhone after eating a bucket of fried chicken. Or some other visual that gets my point across. Just use a nice thin layer of epoxy. Once it's all coated, you just start layering your pieces into your bending form. I just have this one clamp at the back to hold them in place, which you don't even really need because the pressure from the outside of the form pretty much holds them where you need them to be anyways. So layer by layer, stick by stick, strip by strip, I start building up to the thickness of 2 1/4 inches. Putting a strip in, moving my clamp, and grabbing another strip. Before I clamped them all together, I took a hammer and I gave them a good tap just to make sure that all the pieces were seated nice and flush on the bottom of my form. Then starting at the top, I just started throwing on clamps. On the left, on the right, just working my way along, making sure that each piece was getting pulled nice and tight to the outside of that form. Remember, we're trying to perfectly match this shape. So if you have any gaps between your strips and the form, well, you're not perfectly matching the shape now, are you? In no time, I had all the clamps on, and whew, my forearms were pretty tired. But it was looking good, and I was pretty happy with how it was turning out so far. Now to get this thing milled down. That'll be a doozy. This video was sponsored by Husk. Currently, for all my viewers, Husk is running, wait for it, a 70% discount on their authentic Japanese knives. You can test the Husk knife with a 30-day money-back guarantee. The deal won't last for long, so make sure to check it out by clicking my special link in the video description and a pinned comment below. Made from high-quality Japanese stainless steel, this knife features a hygienic rustic style handle and a 38-degree blade edge that ensures extreme sharpness. Husk knives come out of the box razor sharp, and they'll stay that way for years. The sharp blade makes sure that the knife won't slip from applying unnecessary force and won't hurt your hands. A great knife like this can honestly revolutionize your daily meal prep. Rather than buying a few cheap knives that will rust and dull easily and won't be convenient or efficient, get a professional quality knife for all your needs. Remember that right now Husk is offering a 70% discount to all my viewers. You can test the Husk knife with a 30-day money-back guarantee. The deal won't last for long, so make sure to check it out by clicking my special link in the video description and pinned comment below. While I waited for my half circle to dry in the bending form, I decided to take a break from the hard stuff and do something I knew how to do very well, and that was to make all the drawer faces for the lower portion of my cabinet. Now for the drawer faces, I'm just doing simple shaker style drawers, so I start cutting down all of my pieces to size for the outside frame of each drawer face. Next, I go over to the table saw and I make a nice groove down the center of each one of my pieces. I like to do this by running it through on one side, flipping it around, and running it through on the other side. This gives me a nice 1/4 inch groove that is perfectly centered within my piece. Then using my Rockler crosscut sled and my dado stack in my table saw, I cut some nice tenons on each side of my longer rail pieces. And they look something like this. And if I did it right, those will fit perfectly into the styles of each drawer face. And what do you know? They slide in nice and smooth like a pickle into a pile of peanut butter. Boom. And with that, we've got a frame for a drawer face. Just to give you a little idea of timeline here, I'm still working on my doors and have been at this point for about 2 days, and these drawer faces took me all of 20 minutes to put together. After getting my frames all done, I took a piece of 1/2-inch Baltic birch and I cut a nice rabbet around the perimeter over on the dado saw. Now I like to use 1/2-inch stock for the inside of my drawer faces, and I'll show you why right here. It's because if you use 1/4 inch, well, when you put your hardware on the front, you can sometimes pull that center panel in towards the drawer box and create a little dent. But if you use 1/2-inch with a rabbet, it's flush on the back side and just looks like a regular floating panel on the front side. Once I had my drawer faces all put together, I went over to my face frame just to test and make sure that they fit in with the proper reveal around all 4 sides. And what do you know? Tape measures work. About 24 hours after I put this thing in clamps, I took it out of clamps. My epoxy was nice and dry, and moment of truth, well, staying bent. I mean, that's a good sign. And I'm pretty happy about it. Oh. Bent lamination jokes. You gotta love it. Now to mill this thing down to 3/4 of an inch. Now when I glued this up, it was about 1 1/4 inches because I knew it wasn't gonna be perfect coming out of those clamps. So I just went over to my joiner and ran it through like a normal board. The only difference was I had to make a little U-turn as I went through, and that got me a perfectly flush bottom surface. Then I went over to the planer and, well, it wouldn't fit in that way, and it wouldn't fit in that way, but I thought just maybe I could stick it in, flip a U-turn while it was in the middle of the machine, and pull it out the back side. It's so crazy, it just might work. Here goes nothing. In, turn, and out. What do you know? Who needs a bigger planer when you can just turn corners with things? In no time, I was able to mill the entire thing down to 3/4 of an inch to match my face frame, and I went over to test and see if it fit the way I wanted it to. And what do you know? It was an absolutely dead-on perfect fit. And this isn't just movie magic, it really fit that good. I swear. Believe me. With it fitting in there nice and tight, it was time to build out the rest of my door. So measuring from the top down, I marked each side at just a random location, making sure it was about 2 to 3 inches past where it started to curve. Then I went over to my miter saw and I cut it down right on that line on both sides. This gave me a nice square edge on each side of that curve that I could use to then build out the remainder of my door. And it looked something like, wait for it, come on, hurry up, we got things to do, this. Nice half circle with just a little bit extra on each side. Then I plopped that in place and lined it back up with the marks I made both on my face frame as well as that inner piece. Then I measured the distance from side to side between my stiles on the bottom, and I cut a piece to fit nice and tight in between there. Now you might be thinking, all these pieces are fitting really tight. Don't you need a little reveal around the outside? Well, yes, we do, but don't worry, I've got a plan for that, and I'll show you here in a little bit. Next, I had to hook that bottom piece to my top curve. And I thought the easiest way to do this would be by cutting some half laps. So I went over to my dado saw and just used the crosscut sled, and I cut half laps on both sides of that bottom piece that were the exact same thickness as all of my pieces, which was, 2¼ inches. Once I had the laps cut on that bottom piece, I stuck it back in place. Next, I needed to cut the laps on this top piece. Now, I thought about making some crazy jig to do this, and then I decided I was overthinking it. I just squared the edge right up against my fence, held it down with a clamp on the crosscut sled, and just cut my half laps. Sometimes it's better just to go for it and quit thinking so much, because I probably would have spent a couple hours making a jig, and this worked absolutely perfect, so why not? The only thing was, to do it this way, I had to cut opposite laps on each side. So you see that one was on the top, and then I flip it around this way, and this lap will be on the bottom, which honestly won't matter at all. I just got to make sure to account for that with my connecting pieces. So remind me when we get to that part of the video that I need to cut the laps opposite on one side of this thing. So with my half laps cut on the top piece and the bottom piece, I stuck both of those pieces back in, made sure they were nice and lined up, and now I needed to cut the connecting pieces. First I'll cut this side because, well, it doesn't have the opposite ones like on the other side, so it seems a little simpler. So I just measured how long that needed to be for a nice tight fit, went back over to the dado saw, and yep, cut some more laps. Remember, these are both on the same side. We haven't got to the confusing one yet. With both of these cut, I stuck them in to see if it would fit, and it should slide in nice and tight, just like this. Beautiful. Now to do the other side. Now remember, I have to cut opposite laps. So I cut a lap on one side, and then, whew, you thought I was going to forget, didn't you? See, I'm a little confused even here, but don't worry. I got it right. You guys have no faith in me at all, do you? And with that lap cut, I went back over and threaded it into place. I guess not thread it. Weave it, set it, smush it, and the outside of my door frame is done. Now you might also be saying, well, isn't there supposed to be two doors? Well, I'm glad you asked. Yes, there is. I just thought it'd be easier to make one giant door and then just cut it into two pieces once it was all glued up. That's why for this middle piece, I went really wide. Actually, it's 4.5 inches wide because that's twice as wide as 2 1/4. Well, to be honest, it's 4.5 plus 3/32 because that's how wide my saw blade is in my track saw. So after I remove 3/32 material in the middle, then I'll be left with 2 1/4. And 3/32 just happens to be the exact amount I want for my reveal. So it'll work out perfect. That probably made no sense to you, but it's okay. I'll explain later. After using a razor blade to mark where my laps needed to be on my frame pieces, I used a pencil from the bottom side to mark where my lap needed to be on the upper portion of this board. You see, because this one's curved. That takes it up a notch. We'll deal with that later. Then I went over to the table saw and I cut the laps on this piece. First on the bottom end because that's just a standard straight lap. Then I cut the one on the top. Well, I cut as close to that curved line as I could, but I didn't cut right to it because we're going to have to do a little fancy chisel work to match that curve. So after removing as much material as I could, so it looked like this, and yes, this lap is way longer than it needs to be, but that's okay. We'll fix it in a while. I scored that curved line again just with a razor blade to start the cut, and then I grabbed a hand tool. Yeah, that's right. I do know how to use hand tools every once in a while. And just with a chisel by hand, I matched that curve and cleaned it up until it looked nice and silky smooth. Then I went over and tested to see if this was going to fit. Now, no, I don't have the corresponding laps cut on the outside frame yet, but I can still test to see if it'll fit at least halfway in there. And man, I am on a roll. It fit flippin' perfect. Then I went over again to the table saw, cut some more laps, this one on the bottom, and yep, perfect fit. Dynamite. Now here's the real tricky part. Not this bottom piece, but that upper piece, because I have no square surface for a reference. So I just set it on there and eyeballed it. But don't worry, I didn't cut right to my line. I stayed about a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch back from my lap line. I figured it'd be much easier to get a perfect line with a chisel again rather than trying to do it over on the table saw. So after just sticking on a nice shoulder block to keep my chisel nice and square, I tap-a-rooney, and the lap on my top piece was done. And let's see. Yep, it's gonna fit in there nice and snug. Whew, that was a lot of lap cutting, but we got them all done. So with all of our half laps cut, it was as simple as just gluing and clamping everything together. So I spread some glue on, I clamped on these little square cauls to make sure that they were clamped nice and square, and I glued some more laps together. Again, just taking my time, adding plenty of clamps, making sure everything was nice and even, and then finally I clamped in this middle divider. Now you'll see when I put it in place that the lap on the top extends way past the top of the cabinet doors, but that's okay. I did it that way so that I wouldn't have to try and cut by hand a perfect radius on the top to match that. We'll just come in later with the flush trim bit and we'll cut it perfect. Well, let's not do it later. Let's actually do it right now because our glue's all dried up. So I just grabbed the flush trim bit, zip, zop, zoop, and what do you know? Perfect radius on the top of our cabinet door. Ah, yeah. Then I decided to set the whole thing back in my face frame and just make sure that it stayed the shape that it was supposed to stay when I glued it up. And man, I am on a roll with these perfect fits. Let's see if we can keep up this momentum on our next step, which is cutting a nice rabbet on the inside of each opening for our glass. That's right, I'm putting glass in these suckers, because, well, that's what my wife wants. Actually, I have no choice when it comes to the design of this piece. So I just grabbed a rabbeting bit, went around the entire inside, and gave myself a nice little lip to set some glass on. But of course all the corners were rounded over from the rabbeting bit, so I had to come back in with a chisel by hand and square up each corner. Either that or have them cut the glass around, but that just seemed too complicated. And when I say have them cut the glass, I'm saying that because I'm just going to make a little 1/4-inch plywood template, drop it off at my local glass shop, and they will cut pieces to perfectly match each internal hole glass area. So my template looks like this, and I'll let them take it from there. Now remember earlier when I said you're probably wondering about why this fits perfectly tight within the face frame? Doesn't it need a reveal around the entire outside? Well, worry no more, because this is where we take care of that. Now I thought about the best way to shrink this in by 3/32 of an inch all the way around. I had a rabbeting bit, but it only went to 1/8 of an inch, and I wanted it just a hair smaller for my reveal. So I just wrapped some tape around the bearing until it shrunk down to 3/32. I got this idea from my friend Keith Johnson, and what do you know? It worked great. Once I cut a 3/32 groove on the outside of the entire cabinet, all I had to do now was flip the entire thing over, come in with the flush trim bit, which is quickly becoming the all-star tool of this build, and now my entire cabinet door is shrunk down by exactly 3/32 of an inch all the way around. And if you remember me saying, when we cut this down the middle, the saw blade is also 3/32 of an inch, so the reveal in the center will match perfectly. We hope. We'll find out here very quickly. Next, I added some playing cards to get it nice and centered within my face frame, and I marked dead center on the top and bottom of my door. Then I grabbed my trusty track saw with that thin curved blade. It's probably not exactly 3/32 of an inch because it's in millimeters, I think, but it's pretty darn close. So I just cut the entire thing in two. After spending all that time to put it together, I just cut it apart. But now we have two identical doors that come together to make a perfect half circle. One on this side and one over here on this side. And with that, there's just a few little things to wrap up on these. Next, I needed to mark and drill out for my European style hinges. People from Europe get mad when I call them European style hinges. They're like, why do you call them that? We just call them hinges. Well, yeah, it's because you're in Europe, you weirdos. With those drilled out, I tested to make sure my hinges wouldn't overlap my glass, which they won't. Speaking of glass, by this time I got my custom cut glass back from the glass shop. Let's see if those glass cutters can cut a piece of glass to fit my template. Oh, and boom. They fit perfect. What do you know? Gotta love those professional guys. Now, whenever I'm putting glass in cabinet doors, I like to use these Rockler brand glass clips, I guess is what you'd call them. You could add a little piece of bead molding on the inside and kind of lock that glass in permanently, but I like the option to take it out if I ever want to put solid panels in there. Or if my son throws a dinosaur through the pane of glass, well, I can replace it after the fact. So you just kind of throw these clips on, pre-drill, and screw them in place. And in no time, installed. And with that, our doors are completely finished. Well, they're not finished in the sense that they have finish on them. This all does still need to get painted. And come to think of it, I need to build the entire cabinet carcass as well. But I got a leg up on this project, and if you come back next week, you can see me finish it.
Ha! How about that? Glass cabinet doors with a nice curve. Like the curves of your grandma's hips. And her hips don't lie, and neither do I. So when I say that this is part one of a two-part video, I mean it. Next week, this whole thing becomes three-dimensional. That's right. We're taking it up a notch, finishing this cabinet off, and you can see exactly how I build out the box. And I'll tell you what, it's not as simple as you might think, because there's gonna be some curves to that as well. So stay tuned for next week's video. Subscribe if you're not doing so already. Go sign up on Patreon, check out the video description for product links, and visit my website and pick yourself up a nice t-shirt. Well, this is a flannel, but you get the picture. See ya.